Mr. Bondi here with our next botany lesson, this time taking a look at starting our taxonomy unit, specifically looking at bryophytes today, which are more commonly referred to as mosses. And let's take a look first back at the cladogram of plants. This shows kind of like, I guess, a breakdown of their evolutionary past or the differences between the different types of plants that we see. And if we take a look here, we can see our ancestor algae plant here. And then we have our first branch into mosses, which are what we're going to look at today. Again, bryophytes are the scientific name of these plants. And what's key here is that they do not have this water conducting or vascular tissue like all other plants have. So that's going to be one of the major distinguishing features as we take a look at these bryophytes. I love this image here referring to moss as nature's carpet because it certainly acts like that, a very low growing plant that will grow in the shade and just in moist areas. So let's take a look a little bit closer at bryophytes or mosses. Again, their scientific name is bryophytes, and they are non-vascular. What I like about in this image over here to the right, it's showing a moss gametophyte, and I put in parentheses over here, I put the word leaf. Now, it's really a bit misleading to call this a leaf, because technically they are not leaves because they do not have vascular tissue. If you look really closely, you can see what looks like some sort of tube going inside of each one of these little leaflets. It is not true vascular tissue like what we find in a normal plant leaf. And by the way, this is zoomed in really far because these moss gametophytes are quite small. And you can they're so thin you can actually see the individual cells as we zoom in a little bit on it. But what's so key about these is that they do not have that typical form to transport water around like other plants do, which then limits a lot of what they can do in their day-to-day lives. Bryophytes have life cycles that rely heavily upon the use of water, and we'll see this in a few minutes when we take a look at their life cycle. But in order to move their sperm and egg around and then to transport their spores, they rely heavily on water. To get the water inside of them, like I said, because they don't have a vascular system, they just use osmosis. And osmosis is the movement of water from an area where there's a lot of it to an area where there's not a lot of it. So really the moss in this case, or the bryophytes, are acting just like a sponge. By their bodies having less water in them than in the soil around them, they can actually draw that water up into them and then use it for their photosynthesis. But if the ground is dry, that they cannot pull water up, and if they have a lot of water inside of them already, they won't pull water up. They're reliant upon how much water is in the soil or in the growing area that they're at. Most bryophytes tend to grow in places that do not get a lot of sun and that have quite a bit of moisture. Again, because they lack vascular tissue, they cannot store water well. So since they cannot store water, they need to have constant access to it. And because that these plants have been essentially out-evolved by all of the other varieties of plants, they get out-competed for sunlight. They're very short, and so therefore they cannot out-compete something like a tree, for example, which can just put it in the shade. So they have adapted to be able to live within very shaded areas. Mosses and lichens are very commonly used as what we call pioneer species for a process that's called primary succession. This is a concept that was discussed in your biology class, where you go from an area of bare rock into an area that can be inhabited by a community of organisms. Remember the definition of a community, it's all of the organisms, all of the species within that given area. So if we take a look at this diagram here, we can see that in this area, we start off with just bare rock. And so this is what could have been, for example, on early Earth before organisms started to come onto land. There would have been no soil there. Or this could be the type of situation if after you have, say, a volcanic eruption or something like that, and you have just pure rock. Well, in order to get that to a place where living things can actually live there, you need soil. Well, soil is primarily composed of dead plant matter and broken down rock. Well, you need plant matter, so you need a plant that can live there, and that's where the moss and the lichen come in. This moss, this lichen, because they have such low nutrient requirements, can actually live in this area. And their roots, which are really called rhizoids, can work their way into the little cracks within the rock and cause those cracks to get a little bit bigger, aiding to the weathering and the breakdown of those rocks. That just coupled with the normal life cycle of the moss, they live, they die, their bodies will decompose. You can start to create a layer of soil. Now, albeit very thin at first, but it will grow and grow and grow. Eventually, you get large enough to where you can start to support some more complicated plants, like these annual weeds, these perennial weeds and grasses, up to shrubs, and then eventually making your way up to a mature forest, which has a very thick layer of soil. All of this started, though, with the action of the moss and the lichens. If it were not for them, we would never get to a point where we could have such a diverse community in this ecosystem here. The most common variety of bryophytes are mosses. They're the ones that we talk about the most. There's over 12,000 species currently right now on the planet. And as I mentioned, they can grow in some very nutrient-poor environments like the side of these rocks, for example, or on tree bark, which is not designed to be very nutritious. And by the way, you don't see many things of any kind really going and gnawing on tree bark, right? So moss, the fact that they can grow on it just gives more evidence to their ability to grow in nutrient-poor places. Or in the sides of these bricks here, again, not a whole lot of nutrients to draw from within those places. Here we have an image, an artistic drawing, a side view of a moss that includes, or a bryophyte that includes all of its parts. And there's some key parts to take note of here. We'll start at the top at the structure that's called the sporophyte. And what's key is when we think about that name, sporophyte, specifically the spore part of it, this is the location of where spores are going to be made and released. Now I also note here that this is a diploid part of the plant. Diploid is referring to the number of chromosomes that are in the cells of this part. Diploid means 2 sets of chromosomes. So they are like our body cells that make up, say, us as humans, are diploid as well. Haploid, which is what we'll find in the gametophyte, are cells that have just a single chromosome, a single set of chromosomes inside of their cells. These are similar to the sperm and egg cells that we and other animals create. What's interesting, though, is that they have a whole body part that is haploid and a separate body part that is diploid. The whole portion up here, which includes the capsule and the stalk, which we call the sporophyte, is all diploid. And then all of the green portion down here is the haploid portion, or what we call the gametophyte. The gametophyte. Now this section here is where photosynthesis will take place. Also, sperm and eggs are made here in this portion of the plant. These plants do reproduce sexually. The combination of sperm and egg come together to form spores, which then create the new individuals. The final thing to show is the rhizoid, which is, again, carefully noted, is not a root because it lacks vascular tissue, but it functions in a similar way as a root. Its job is to do water absorption and to hold the plant in place. Notice how all of these plant parts don't have the common names, right? Like we don't call this portion right here the leaves, again, because they lack vascular tissue. No vascular tissue means we can't call it a leaf. So this is called a gametophyte. No vascular tissue inside of the structure here, we call it a rhizoid, and we don't call it a root. Here I have an actual image of some moss, a side view of it, where you can see all of those parts. And down here I have the gametophyte, which would be the green portion, which is much shorter and where the photosynthesis takes place. And then right here in between those brackets, you can see one of many sporophytes, where you have the stalk and the capsule at the end of it that will then produce the spores. Here's another variety of a bryophyte. They're called hornworts. There's 3 varieties. Mosses is the first, hornworts is the second. And what's unique about these is that they have the sporophyte portions look very much like a horn, and a green horn, hence the name. If you take a look at the gametophytes in this image, the darker green portions, like you can see a good clump of gametophyte right in through here, they look very similar to the third type of bryophytes, which are called liverworts. Liverworts, the name again comes from the fact that they have very broad, lobed-like gametophytes that really look kind of like a liver, have similar shaped gametophytes as we saw in the hornworts as well. Those are our 3 varieties of bryophytes. We take a look at the life cycle of a bryophyte, and there's quite a bit going on here. It doesn't matter really where we start. So let's start right here with the spores being released from the sporophytes. So the spore is a haploid component. And so let's just really quickly review again what haploid means. Haploid means that we have one set of chromosomes, and it's oftentimes depicted by just the letter N. The letter N means that it's haploid. So these individual spores can then become a gametophyte. And they can become either a female gametophyte or they can become a male gametophyte. Remember, the gametophyte is the green portion of the plant. It'll also contain a rhizoid as well. Well, if it's a male gametophyte, its job is going to then be to produce sperm. If it's a female gametophyte, its job will then be to produce eggs. Notice how that the location of the sperm and egg production happens at the very tips of these gametophytes. Those eggs the sperm then can be released, and typically it's then carried by water, and it can make its way over to a female gametophyte where fertilization can take place. Once the sperm combines with the egg, we can then start to grow the sporophyte portion of the plant. That sporophyte portion is diploid. Now, again, diploid means that we have two sets of chromosomes. Well, where do those two sets of chromosomes come from? They came from the combination of sperm with egg. So 1N here plus 1N here gives us our 2N zygote or fertilized egg that then becomes the sporophyte. This sporophyte will then grow and develop spores that can then repeat this process all over again. Humans do use mosses for a few things, although they're not very commonly used. We do not use moss for food. It is not edible, and that's primarily because the fact that it grows in such nutrient-poor environments that it itself has very low nutrients. But we can use specifically a type of moss called sphagnum moss as a natural sponge, and it works really well at absorbing water. Peat is another type of moss. It can actually be cut and pressed to form fuel. And here's an image of peat moss that can then be burned as a fuel source right there. And then finally, it can be used as a soil additive, as we're seeing in this bag of soil here, to help with, again, the retaining of water and also to increase the soil acidity, which many plants thrive in that environment. And that's it on bryophytes. Hopefully you enjoyed taking a look at our most simplistic variety of plants, mosses and their relatives. Up next, we'll take a look at ferns, which incorporate a vascular system and are a bit more complex.